Hey guys, it's Frozenballz here, and welcome to another episode of Minmaxer's Playground. Today's episode is going to be covering Mag. Mag went through a rework. She went from being a frame that, at the touch of one button, could wipe out entire platoons of shielded enemies regardless of whatever level they were, to a frame that became a starter frame that could shred both armored as well as shielded enemies as well at the same time. After Mag's rework, her playstyle definitely did change, and before we actually talk about the builds, I'm just going to talk about the two main abilities and how they've changed and how they kind of function now. The way Shield Polarize worked was, when you press the button, it would basically detonate the shields of all enemies within the radius of the ability itself. This detonation would also do damage to both the enemies as well as other enemies within the radius, and this was exceedingly powerful for the simple reason that grouped up enemies would basically do damage to each other as well at the same time, and that damage would basically result in wiping out squads of regardless of whatever level the enemies was. And because of this, this ability had endless scaling. Think of the shield detonations as an endlessly scaling M prime detonation. Going from that, Shield Polarize has now changed to an ability where it expands outward like a magnetic wave, similar to how Nova's M prime effect expands outward. This magnetic wave restores your shield and the shields of teammates when it touches them. The wave created by Shield Polarize travels at 7.5 meters a second, and it does a certain amount of damage, but this damage is multiplied when it touches enemies' armor or shields. This extra damage is stored as shards which you can find on the ground, and these shards are affected by Magnetized. So say for example you cast Magnetized over an area which has got a bunch of shards, those shards will be pulled towards the center and they'll contribute to the damage of the Magnetized bubble. Bear in mind, enemies that have no armor or shields do not create additional shards. Just like the previous version of Shield Polarize, any shield that gets completely drained results in an explosion, which in this case is a magnetic explosion. This explosion has a damage multiplier that is affected by power strength, and the explosion damage diminishes based on the distance. One thing to note is that this detonation does not have any line of sight checks, and that the detonation is affected by power range mods. Just like how M prime is affected by power duration, the pulse wave lasts longer the more duration you have on the ability. The speed at which the wave expands outward cannot be changed. Another thing to point out is that if an enemy has both shield and armor, you have to drain the shield completely before armor stripping will start. Because this ability is affected by power strength in terms of the shield restoration, the shield depletion, the armor depletion, and the shard damage multiplier, you need to make sure you've got enough power strength for it to shine properly. Before Mag's rework, there used to be a build that used to revolve around using Greedy Mag, but at this point, with the changes that came into Greedy Mag and how it's now line of sight based and it doesn't really pull loot for everyone, it's not really worth using a build which is dedicated to just Greedy Mag right now. You can use it if you have a spare slot on your build, but at this point there's no really reason to actually use it, to be honest. There are better mods which you can use. When it comes to Crush, the only build that's relevant is the CC Crush build, which uses the augment, but I'll explain that later. The next ability is Magnetized. This ability has basically replaced the old Shield Polarize in terms of being the new DPS power for Mag. Magnetized is basically a combination of the old bullet attractor with some new design elements attached to it as well at the same time. The way this ability works is that it creates a bubble on an anchor point, which is in this case an enemy. Any projectiles or any bullets that enter the ability get instantly drawn to the center, and any enemy that is caught inside the bubble will be taking excessive damage from the ability. Projectile weapons benefit mostly, especially if they have punch through, because those bullets will keep rotating around inside the bubble and keep hitting the enemy over and over, and thus increasing your DPS. As previously mentioned, Magnetized also pulls in polarized shards as well that are created when you use Shield Polarize. Any damage that comes in while the Magnetized bubble is active will be pulled into the Magnetized bubble itself. Whether this is damage coming from teammates, whether this is damage coming from enemies, everything will be pulled in towards the center, and it'll, hit all the enemies that are caught inside the Magnetized bubble. All of this damage is affected by power strength and has a damage multiplier applied to it. On top of all of this, the actual Magnetized bubble will be doing a dot which does 25% damage of all the damage that is absorbed into the bubble at the given time. So instantly you have an ability which has endless scaling as well at the same time. But that's not all. If the enemy on which the Magnetized is cast is killed, the bubble will explode. The damage of this bubble is up to 200% of the total damage that is inside the field at that given time. Again, since this ability scales infinitely, the amount of damage that the bubble can store is infinite, obviously going up to the maximum integer value that the game currently allows. The field duration is affected by power duration, obviously, and power range increases the range of the bubble as well as the explosion radius as well at the same time. Power strength affects the damage multiplier and the explosion damage as well, and it's something to point out that the explosion damage of this bubble has got line of sight checks. You can literally cast 4 bubbles in the same spot, and whenever you kill any enemies inside that same area, all 4 bubbles will be charged up with all the damage that you do. So when they do detonate, all 4 bubbles will have that extra damage which they've stored up as well. However, you cannot chain bubble explosions one after the other to feed the bubble to have like a perpetual, detonation chain going. Bear in mind that while you can, stack the damage on certain choke points like this, and you can hold the hallway very, very well, overall, especially on bigger maps, it's better to actually cover more area with multiple bubbles, on different enemies. Since we now know that you can charge up the bubble, teammates can charge up the bubble, and even enemies attacking can charge up the bubble, we're going to combine this with radiation. Radiation procs basically enable friendly fire. So if you have a weapon that spreads radiation procs effectively, you can apply that radiation proc to these enemies and allow them to charge up the bubble by them attacking each other itself, as opposed to you shooting into the bubble and charging it up. Since enemies' damage scales based on their levels as well, you can technically make this bubble do level appropriate damage as well, because it now has endlessly scaling damage being absorbed into the bubble and being thrown outward when the bubble explodes. So now that we've talked about the abilities, let's talk about Mag's builds. There are primarily 2 builds which I use. First is the Magnetized build, which has endless scaling as we previously talked, and the second build is the Fracturing Crush CC build, which I talked about a little bit in the Nova video. Due to the way Magnetized works and the way Shield Polarize also works, you need to have duration on this build. Power Strength will increase the amount of armor stripping that Polarize can do, and it'll also increase the damage multipliers of Magnetized, and because of that, Power Strength is the most important mod for Mag right now. Having range means you're going to be able to hit more enemies and capture more enemies in your bubble, and the explosion radius is also affected by power range mods at the same time. Since you're going to be using power strength mods and blind rage is going to be one of those mods, you need to have some sort of efficiency in this build as well, which is why streamline comes into the equation. So in terms of the build, you're going to be using a combination of blind rage and power drift. This will give you 214% power strength. You want to be having range, so stretch is definitely an important mod to have, and it's better to use cunning drift as opposed to overextended, because you don't want to take that negative hit in power strength, since power strength is so important for Mag. Prime flow and quick thinking will give you that pseudo tank and that bigger power pool for spamming your abilities, especially since you're using blind rage and that is so expensive in terms of casting abilities. Prime continuity gives you enough duration for your abilities that you can stack enough damage. Stretch and cunning drift also affect the explosion radius, as I previously mentioned, which is why you kind of want to have more range as well on this particular build. Handspring is a handy mod. It's a utility mod which I tend to use more often than not, because being on your back means you're most likely going to die, and you want to have that extra survivability through utility. Prime continuity gives you enough duration for your abilities, so you can actually, have a bubble up for a good chunk of time, keep pumping damage into it, increasing the overall damage of that bubble, so when it does eventually blow up, it's gonna, create a lot of damage. As with most builds, corrosive projection is the aura of choice. That changes based on whatever faction you're fighting. When it comes to arcanes for Mag, I tend to default with arcane energized, just because using such an expensive build in terms of power, being able to spam and get power back from arcane energized or even Zenuric focus school is kind of important for me, as opposed to using Naramon or Madurai or any other arcane available either. The second build revolves around using Fracturing Crush. I talked about this build briefly in the Nova video, but I'm going to elaborate on it now. The whole purpose of this build is to use it for crowd control, especially in high-level missions, and you combine it with a slow Nova. As previously mentioned, a slow Nova's effect basically has like a time dilation effect. So any CC abilities that you do when the enemies are slowed down with, maximum slow, the duration of the CC effects gets stretched out as well at the same time. So for that perspective, the whole purpose of this build is to crowd control entire groups of enemies and then have them locked down in one particular area so they can't move and they can't capture objectives, so you go through missions much quicker. The best application of this one is for when you're trying to do a sortie interception mission and you don't want to kill enemies, you just want to get through the mission really, really quickly. For this particular build to work, you want to be using maximum range, which is attained by using overextended, stretch, and cunning drift. When you combine prime continuity with constitution, you get a high enough duration that CC effect from Fracturing Crush lasts for a long enough duration. Streamline is your efficiency mod, which you're going to have there to increase your amount of efficiency, and prime flow and quick thinking is going to be your pseudo tank plus a bigger energy pool. Corrosive projection is the aura of choice again. When it comes to arcanes, arcane energize is again the one which I default to, and Zenuric is the focus school which I default to. The way Fracturing Crush works is that enemies that are affected by Crush, their armor is reduced by 50% and they become unable to move for a certain duration. This duration is affected by duration mods, and even though the armor removal has an upper cap of 50%, it is also downscaled with power strength. So if you have negative power strength, the amount of armor removed gets reduced as well. Just bear in mind, enemies that are affected by Fracturing Crush are only immobilized. They can still shoot you while being stuck in their same position, which is why you combine this build with a Loki to disarm them. Since this does not have any line of sight checks either, you can effectively lock down entire rooms. This allows for faster completion and more easy completion of interception missions. Overall, Mag is a pretty good frame. Despite the rework that came in, despite the uproar about the changes that came to Shield Polarize, she still has the DPS output as before, and now she can actually deal with armored enemies as well as shielded enemies as well. One of the reasons why Shield Polarize was changed was because it was promoting AFK play, and Warframe has always moved in a direction where they kind of try to promote active play as opposed to AFK play. Hopefully this gives a little bit of insight on how Mag is still relevant and still performs pretty well, especially when you build her correctly and you use her to her strengths. I do want to say one thing though, I do apologize for the lack of videos recently because I'm currently pushing for partnership on Twitch, so I've been pretty busy with that, focusing primarily on that, so I haven't actually had much time to do YouTube stuff in general. An extension on that, by the way, I do stream quite a bit and I am primarily a streamer, so if you ever decide you want to watch a stream, whether it's Warframe or any other game, you will find me streaming on Twitch. Link will be in description. I usually stream Mondays, Wednesdays and Saturdays, starting usually around 11 AM, going on the way through till about 5 PM. The reason I stream in the mornings is because that's what my time schedule allows with the job which I currently do. But hopefully if I become a partner on Twitch and hopefully it works out well, I can become a full-time Twitch streamer, which allows me to stream when I want and allow me to do YouTube a bit more openly as well at the same time. As usual, thank you very much for watching, guys. I do appreciate it. If you like what you saw, make sure you leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.